Good morning, class. It's Sean Shetler here with CHRI 6360, New Testament Christology with Dr. Brian Gamble. And today we'll be reviewing the book Jesus and the God of Israel by Richard Bauckham and covering the introduction in chapters 1 and 2. We will discuss and give summary of the book Jesus and the God of Israel by Richard Bauckham, which covers introduction pages IX to XII, chapter 1, God Crucified, which is pages 1 through 59, and chapter 2, Biblical Theology and the Problems of Monotheism, pages 60 through 106. We'll also give critical commentary and application to Christianity today. Summary of Baukham's introduction. In the introduction, Bauckham goes into detail about his first book, God Crucified, which he published in 1998, and launched the thesis, an idea of Christology of divine identity. In that work, his main thesis is that the earliest Christology fully affirmed Jesus' divine identity. It was already the highest Christology. Jesus is included in God's unique identity, not a semi-divine figure. Bauckham uses Jewish categories, creator, ruler, not Greek metaphysics. Early Christians affirmed Jesus' full divinity within Second Temple monotheism. Divine functions, creation and sovereignty, intrinsic to God's identity. The crucified Jesus reveals who God truly is, echoed later by Martin Luther. And there is essays in the volume which are working papers toward a fuller study. Bauckham responds to critiques and remains committed to this research. This chart summarizes the foundational elements of Baukham's introduction. At the heart of his argument is the claim that the earliest Christian view of Jesus placed him fully within the divine identity of the one God of Israel. Instead of relying on Greek metaphysics, Bauckham turns to Jewish monotheistic thought, showing how roles like creation and universal rule belong to God and are also attributed to Jesus. This means early Christology wasn't a break from Judaism, but a profound development within it. The second half of Baukham's introduction and argument emphasizes a powerful theological claim. Not only the exalted, but also the crucified Jesus reveals God's identity. This challenges traditions that highlight only glory and divinity while neglecting the cross. Bauckham notes that while the Nicene Fathers preserved Jesus' divine status, they often underemphasized the cross. This theme was more fully recovered in Martin Luther's theology of the cross, which sees divine identity revealed in suffering. The essays in this volume, though originally presented in various settings, have been revised to support this larger argument. While not his final comprehensive work, this collection makes a substantial contribution to ongoing scholarly conversations about Jewish monotheism and New Testament Christology. Chapter 1, Crucified God. This chapter is part of the initial 59-page vignette that Bauckham originally wrote in 1998. In this chapter, Baukham's main thesis was that Jesus was always understood as part of God's identity. Some points from the chart, from the chapter. Second Temple Judaism defines God by unique roles, not metaphysical essence. Jesus, being the creator, sovereign, and worthy of worship, places him within the unique identity. Radical Christian claim. is that Jesus' crucifixion is not divine absence, but revelation. Isaiah 40 through 55 is an anchor in this chapter, which reveals that early Christians saw that suffering servant as revealing Yahweh's identity. And this shapes our understanding of divine power, seen most clearly in the cross. And the chapter focuses on 1 Corinthians 8:6, a foundational text for early high Christology. Chapter 1, Crucified God, section 1.2. Early Christians didn't see the cross as a problem for monotheism. It was the ultimate revelation of who God is. The cross is not a detour, but a window into God's heart. Bauckham focuses on Philippians 2:6 through 11 and Isaiah 45, verse 23. Paul sees Jesus as pre-existent and voluntarily descending into humility. The name above every name is a reference to Yahweh in Isaiah 45. The worship of Jesus doesn't break monotheism, it confirms his inclusion in the divine identity. Revelation 5 emphasizes how the Lamb who was slain is not only honored but enthroned. Jesus' death is not a contradiction to divine authority, it's the basis of it. The slain lamb receives the same worship as God. John 12:32 and Isaiah 40 through 55. Lifted up in John means both being nailed to a cross and being glorified. Echoes Isaiah's suffering servant. Jesus reveals God through love, sacrifice, and suffering. The cross becomes the moment when God's glory is clearest. This chapter 1, Crucified God, overturns assumptions. Divine identity isn't just about power, it's about love willing to suffer. The cross redefines majesty, not in domination, but in humble service. And this text affirms a central theme. Jesus' humiliation and exaltation are not separate, but unified revelations of divine identity. Isaiah's vision of the one true God is seen not only in God's sovereign acts, but in Jesus' crucifixion. This is not a new God, but Israel's God fully revealed. Chapter 1, Crucified God, section 1.3. Later in chapter 1, under section 3.5, is unified revelation. The heart of Baukham's argument is that humiliation and exaltation are not opposites. Jesus didn't earn divinity by dying, rather, the cross displays God's identity most clearly. This reflects Isaiah's vision of the one God acting in unexpected but consistent ways. Continuity and novelty 3.6. Early Christians didn't abandon Jewish monotheism, they expanded its scope to include Jesus. Jesus is not added to God, he is within God's very identity. Bauckham balances theological innovation with scriptural faithfulness. Theological reflection on creeds 3.7. The Nicene and Chalcedonian definitions were essential but tended to emphasize nature over narrative. Bauckham cautions us, don't lose sight of the story of the cross where divine identity is lived. Instead, he invites reflection. Are we following a creedal Christ or the crucified and risen Lord? Central claim of the chapter. The early church didn't gradually elevate Jesus, they already saw him as God. The astonishing part, God's most majestic self-revelation is not Sinai or creation, but Calvary. This radically transforms how we define power, majesty, and divinity. Chapter 2 of Biblical Theology and the Problems of Monotheism. Baukham's key critiques the category of monotheism itself may be misleading, especially when applied through the lens of modern or philosophical assumptions. The term monotheism originated in the contrast to polytheism and was shaped significantly by the Enlightenment thinking. In that context, the emphasis is on counting how many gods exist and describing God as an abstract singular essence. But Bauckham challenges this framing. He argues that biblical texts, especially in the Old Testament, do not approach God's uniqueness in abstract philosophical terms. Instead, the emphasis is on God's identity revealed through actions. God is the creator, the sovereign, and the only worthy of worship, one worthy of worship. So when we talk about monotheism biblically, we aren't merely saying there is one God. We are identifying who that one God is and how he acts in history and covenant. Let's now walk through that chart on this side, which contrasts philosophical monotheism with biblical monotheism. Focus. Philosophical monotheism centers on abstract unity or metaphysical simplicity. Biblical monotheism focuses on God's revealed identity, especially as creator and Lord over all. Origin. Philosophical monotheism is rooted in Greek philosophy, while biblical monotheism emerges from the Hebrew narrative tradition, that is, from the story of Israel and God's self-disclosure through history. Defining features. Where philosophy looks for abstract traits like simplicity or unity, biblical faith focuses on who God is, the one who created all things, rules all nations, and alone receives worship. Problem with Jesus. Here's where it gets practical for Christian theology. Under philosophical monotheism, adding Jesus seems like adding a second deity, a major problem. But under biblical monotheism, Jesus can be fully integrated into God's identity because he shares in God's roles of creator, sovereign, and the one worshipped. The key takeaway for us, the Bible is not trying to win an abstract debate about the number of gods. It's about narrating and identifying the one true God by what he does and how he is known, especially in the person of Jesus. Let's move forward and see how this plays out in New Testament texts like 1 Corinthians 8 and John 10. Chapter 2, section 2.2. New Testament authors didn't discard or sidestep Jewish monotheism, particularly the Shema, but rather reinterpret it in light of Jesus. The Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, Deuteronomy 6:4. This was and still is the defining confession of Jewish faith. For centuries, it formed the theological backbone of Israel's belief in one unique Yahweh, God Yahweh. But now in the New Testament, we see something radical. Jesus is being included within that identity, yet monotheism is preserved. Let's walk through the key biblical texts in the chart. Romans 3:28 through 30. Paul refers to the oneness of God as the basis for God's impartiality. Since there is only one God, he is God of both Jews and Gentiles. Jesus is the agent of that salvation, affirming the Shema's continued authority now seen through Christ. 1 Corinthians 8:6. This is the clearest New Testament restatement of the Shema. Paul affirms, for there is one God, the Father, and one Lord Jesus Christ. Paul deliberately uses God for the Father and Lord for Jesus. Titles that together map onto Yahweh our God. Yahweh is one. Jesus is not added to the Shema, he is included within it. John 10:30, where Jesus says, I and the Father are one. This part doesn't deny distinction of persons, but speaks to a unity in divine identity, mission, and authority. The crowd's reaction, wanting to stone him for blasphemy, shows that his claim was clearly understood as one of divine equality. Key takeaway. The New Testament writers did not redefine God to accommodate Jesus. Instead, they recognized in Jesus the very identity of Yahweh, as known from the Shema and throughout Israel's scriptures. Jesus is not an addition to God, he is included within the very identity of the one God of Israel. Let's continue with the trajectory as we examine the broader theological implication in the rest of chapter 2. Chapter 2, section 2.3. Biblical theology, historical monotheism, and Christian faith. The slide highlights why Bockham's argument is not just historically interesting, but deeply relevant for contemporary Christian theology and practice. First, while the Old Testament clearly affirms monotheism, it does so through a relational and narrative lens, telling us who God is through his acts in history, not just stating that only one God exists in abstract terms. The modern scholarly quest to define historical monotheism often focuses on how many gods ancient people believed in. Bockham argues that this misses the heart of biblical faith, which is about God's identity, not merely God's numerical uniqueness. A key insight here is that Jesus' inclusion in the identity of the one God is not a deviation from Jewish monotheism, but a faithful extension of it. Jesus shares the roles that define God in the Old Testament: creator, sovereign, and the one who is worshipped. This has several contemporary implications which are outlined in the chart on the slide. In Christology, Jesus is understood not as subordinate to God, but as fully divine. In worship, honoring Jesus is not idolatrous, it aligns with biblical monotheism. In Revelation, the cross is not a problem to solve, but a window into the very nature of God. In interfaith dialogue, this approach clarifies how Christianity differs from yet remains rooted in Jewish faith. In the doctrine of God, we're encouraged to base our understanding not on Greek metaphysics, but on the biblical story. Ultimately, this theology challenges us today to center the cross in how we understand and proclaim God, not as a detour in divine history, but as the climactic self-revelation of the God of Israel in Jesus Christ. Jesus and the God of Israel. Relevancy for Christianity today. The text reframes how Christians understand the cross, not as defeat, but as divine self-revelation. It strengthens theological confidence in the New Testament portrayal of Jesus' divinity, and it offers a bridge between Christian and Jewish conceptions of God. Jesus and the God of Israel. Critical comments. Bockham's insights challenged later theological constructs to realign with biblical narratives. He raises questions about traditional Trinitarian formulations and their emphasis on ontology over narrative identity. And some theological systems may need recalibration to reflect this early Christological vision. Jesus and the God of Israel, final reflections and application. Jesus is not a deviation from Israel's God, but his fullest self-revelation. Christian theology must root Christology in the biblical narrative, not just philosophical categories. The cross is the clearest window into who God truly is. Relevance for today. It helps believers embrace suffering and humility as part of divine calling. It deepens worship by recognizing the crucified Jesus as the sovereign Lord. Reinvigorates dialogue between Christian and Jewish understandings of God.